talk about
I talk about the relationships, because like on top of all this music and touring and all this kind of stuff, there's life too that you got to deal with.
At 75, Philip Bailey has finally said out loud what fans have quietly suspected for years about the man behind that voice. From a Denver kid who taught himself to sing like the women in his life before he even understood what he was doing.
I grew up mimicking female vocalists because I, for no reason other than I just liked the way Sarah Vaughan and Mahalia Jackson, Morgana King, Dinah Washington, Nancy Wilson, Dionne Warwick, I just love those songs.
To standing at 75 as the last real voice left from the fire that made earth, wind, and fire immortal. The truth about what carried Philip Bailey through all of it is heavier than the music ever let on. So let's get into it. His mother used to tell people that Philip was singing before he could talk, that music was his first language. That single sentence, more than any lyric he ever recorded, is the truest description of who Philip James Bailey is. He came into the world on May 8, 1951, in Denver, Colorado, born to Edward Alvin Bailey and Elizabeth Crossland. And from the moment he could make sound, it seemed to want to become melody.
It just came upon me. I was always musically directed and inclined from a kid. It just made the most sense to me.
By the time he was in 4th grade at Denver's East High School system, he was already doubling as a drummer and a singer. But the more interesting story was happening after school. While other boys his age were outside chasing footballs and getting into whatever trouble the city offered, Philip was going over to a friend's house to sit inside that friend's stepfather's jazz record collection. The stepdad was a jazz bassist. The records were Art Blakey, Philly Joe Jones, Miles Davis, and John Coltrane, and Philip studied them the way a med student studies anatomy. He wanted to know how the sound was built. He loved all of it. Country, top 40 radio, folk, jazz, everything the airwaves offered a curious ear. But the deepest imprint came from something closer to home. He was raised around women. His mother, Elizabeth, and his sister Beverly shaped the household, and the voices that came through their record player were Sarah Vaughan, Nancy Wilson, and Dionne Warwick. Philip did not just listen to those women. He tried to sing like them.
I grew up mimicking female vocalists because I, for no reason other than I just liked the way Sarah Vaughan and Mahalia Jackson, Morgana King, Dinah Washington, Nancy Wilson, Dionne Warwick, I just love those songs.
That single decision, made without any adult ever teaching it to him, is why one of the most famous voices in American music sounds the way it does. His signature falsetto, pure and sweet, and reaching into ranges that men his size are not supposed to touch, was born in a Colorado living room. A black boy imitating black women, learning the geometry of feminine phrasing before he ever knew what he was doing. He was becoming an instrument. He just did not know yet what someone was going to build with it. By the time he was moving through East High School, Denver had quietly become an incubator for what would become one of the most influential black bands in American history. And almost nobody outside its walls realized it. Philip was sharpening his voice in a school choir called the Echoes of Youth. And standing right there in that same choir, another future icon nobody had heard of yet was sharpening her own presence. Her name was Pam Grier. Neither of them yet knew what they were going to be. Grier was not yet the queen of blaxploitation cinema. Bailey was not yet the falsetto that would define an era of American music. They were just two young black kids from Denver singing in a school ensemble. But the echoes of youth was only one piece of it. Philip also formed a group with friends called Mystic Moves, and they made a habit of showing up to a competition called Battle of the Quartets, learning how to hold a stage and hold a note under pressure. Around the same period, he pulled together another band with schoolmates. It was called, at various points, The Electric Black, and then Friends in Love. And its lineup carried names that would matter more than anyone in that room understood. Carl Carwell was in it. Winston Ford was in it. So were Larry Dunn and Andrew Woolfolk, two young Denver musicians who would later become foundational to the Earth, Wind and Fire sound.
I enlisted several of my bandmates from Denver, Larry Dunn and Andrew Woolfolk.
Nobody was watching. Nobody was writing about them. They were teenagers cutting their teeth on gigs at clubs, on functions, on colleges, playing anywhere someone would let them plug in an amp. Through sheer persistence, they became a regular act at a Denver venue called 23rd Street East. And that hard local grind quietly shaped the musical family that would eventually change the sound of black pop. It just did not know yet that it was doing that. Then, in 1971, a single night rewrote his entire future, and he did not even realize it until afterwards. A young band out of Chicago called Earth, Wind and Fire had just released their first album, and they came through Denver on a promotional gig. Philip's group, Friends in Love, was booked to open the show at the Hilton. Standing in the audience and standing on the stage was a man named Maurice White. Maurice was the founder of Earth, Wind and Fire, a former Chess Records session drummer who had left Chicago with a vision most people around him could not quite see. He wanted a band that fused funk and jazz and gospel and philosophy into something that could raise people to a higher level of consciousness. And on that night in Denver, he heard something coming out of the opening act that he could not stop thinking about. He heard Philip Bailey's voice.
We opened the show, they got a chance to actually see us.
The following year, in 1972, Maurice White made the call. He asked Philip to come to Los Angeles and join Earth, Wind and Fire as a lead vocalist, and Philip, still only 21 years old, said yes. Then he did something that reveals how much he trusted his own ear. He turned around and told Maurice they needed to bring two other Denver kids with them. He recommended his high school friend, Larry Dunn, on keys, and he called Andrew Woolfolk, who was studying saxophone in New York with the great Joe Henderson and quietly preparing to walk away from music for a career in banking. Philip talked him out of it. Andrew came west, Larry came west, and with them, the foundation of the classic Earth, Wind and Fire lineup was suddenly in one city. The Denver kids had come to Los Angeles, and they were about to build a fire that would burn across the decade. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary creative runs in the history of American popular music. With Maurice White reshaping the band around a new philosophical concept, and with Philip Bailey's falsetto now sitting at the center of it, Earth, Wind and Fire began releasing exuberant dance music wrapped in metaphysical lyrics, sailing over rhythms that felt genuinely new.
That's how the signature sound was developed over the years. But relatively pretty quickly because, two records in, we were in our stride.
Their live shows became sensory events, all shimmering costumes, dramatic staging, elaborate choreography, and stage magic tricks pulled off by the band themselves. The songs came like a flood. Philip sang lead with his falsetto on Devotion, Keep Your Head to the Sky, Reasons, Fantasy, Star, I've Had Enough, and On Your Face. He shared lead vocals with Maurice White on the songs that became the American soundtrack of the late 1970s, on Can't Hide Love, on That's the Way of the World, on Sing a Song, on Getaway, on Saturday Night, on Serpentine Fire, on September, and on Boogie Wonderland with the Emotions. Album after album climbed the charts. That's the Way of the World topped the Billboard 200 in 1975. Critics eventually reached for the biggest comparison they had. Some began calling Earth, Wind, and Fire the Black Beatles, a phrase that sounds like flattery but was really a plain description of the scale of what they had built. The band ultimately sold roughly 90 million records worldwide. They collected 8 Grammy Awards. They earned a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. They were eventually inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the year 2000, canonized alongside the artists Philip had first heard on his mother's record player.
Thank you very much. Our gifts have truly made room for us before great men, and as you honor us, we know that you definitely honor those who've come before us.
But underneath the numbers and the glow, the group's relentless work ethic was quietly eating the people inside it alive. The touring never stopped. The recording never stopped. And Philip Bailey, still in his 20s, was living a version of the road life that he would not admit to publicly until decades later. The truth Philip Bailey finally put on the page did not arrive until his 2014 memoir, Shining Star, Braving the Elements of Earth, Wind, and Fire. And when it arrived, it was startling in its bluntness. Writing about his very first marriage, he admitted plainly that from the first day he and his wife Janet were married, he had no intention of remaining faithful. He then reached for the reason, saying that as a child, he had not witnessed much faithfulness in his parents' generation. That single passage cracked the polished image most fans had of him. The public Philip Bailey was the born-again gentleman with the golden voice. The private Philip Bailey, the one the memoir finally introduced, had spent his rise living out the seamier road realities of a superstar band. The sex, the drugs, the alcohol, the endless line of women that came with the territory. He was, in his own words, complicit in it, and he refused, later in life, to pretend otherwise.
I talk about, the relationships, because, like on top of all this music and touring and all this kind of stuff, there's life too that you got to deal with.
The consequences of that stretch played out in his personal life for years. He would ultimately be married 3 times. First to Janet Bailey, then to Valerie Bailey, and later to Crystal Johnson Bailey. He fathered 7 children across those relationships and beyond. One of them, his daughter Petey, was born to Jeanette Hutchinson of the legendary R&B group The Emotions. The same group Earth, Wind, and Fire had recorded Boogie Wonderland with in 1979. A child born outside marriage to a woman inside his own musical world. None of that made Philip Bailey a monster. It made him a specific kind of complicated man, one who had inherited a template he did not choose and lived it out before he had the tools to break it. The memoir was, more than anything, an act of adult accountability. He was refusing to let history remember him as only the falsetto and the smile. What made his willingness to write it possible was, in part, the fact that he had already begun to change course years earlier, in a way almost nobody expected from a man at his commercial peak. By 1982, Philip Bailey had decided he needed room. Earth, Wind, and Fire was one of the biggest bands in the world, but the machine that had built it had also boxed him in. And he later said going solo gave him the chance to work far beyond what was expected of him in the group and to use the full range of his instrument without any reservation.
Well, I went solo in the middle of Earth, Wind, and Fire's around in the 80s. I started doing solo records.
His 1983 solo debut, Continuation, peaked at number 19 on the Billboard R&B Albums chart, and stayed there for 30 weeks. Then came the swerve almost nobody saw coming. In 1985, on his second solo album, Chinese Wall, Philip teamed up with a British drummer and singer named Phil Collins, who produced the record and co-wrote a song called Easy Lover with him. Easy Lover hit #1 on the UK pop singles chart and #2 on the Billboard Hot 100, holding chart position for 23 weeks. The single sold in the hundreds of thousands. Chinese Wall itself peaked at #10 on the R&B albums list and #22 on the Billboard 200, and Philip earned a Grammy nomination for Best R&B Vocal Performance. The legendary band had just detonated a second career of his own, and then he did the thing nobody expected. Instead of chasing that pop crossover into a permanent second life as a mainstream star, he pivoted almost immediately into gospel music. His 1985 gospel album, The Wonders of His Love, peaked at #13 on the Billboard Gospel chart. His 1986 gospel album, Inside Out, hit #30 on the R&B chart and even charted in Switzerland and Sweden. And in 1987, he won the Grammy Award for Best Male Gospel Performance for his album, Triumph. It looked, from the outside, like career suicide. The pop world had just crowned him, and he was giving that crown back to sing for God. But something older than fame was pulling him. Something planted in that Denver living room a lifetime earlier, and he was finally beginning to follow it home. Philip Bailey has been careful over the years in how he describes his faith journey. He has resisted the tidy conversion story, the dramatic moment on a stage or in a hotel room where everything changed. What he has said instead is that God had always been beckoning him, and that the change happened more progressively. It was less a sudden turn than a slow homecoming. For the man who wrote openly about his infidelity, the sex, the drugs, the wreckage, that is a much more honest sentence than most celebrity conversion stories offer. Bailey has spoken about having an ongoing relationship with Christ and about how his rediscovery of his Christianity was not a moment, but a life. It has shaped the way he now speaks about his own younger self, with the kind of steady, unshowy accountability that only comes when a person has actually done the work. The tension he carried during the peak was real. There was the pop star making Easy Lover with Phil Collins, and there was the man who could not outrun the woman his mother had raised him to be responsible to. Those two Philips were living inside the same body, and the gospel records were the sound of one of them slowly getting the last word. It also, quietly, reframed what his voice was for. He had spent decades hitting frightening ranges in the falsetto, a natural baritone reaching notes most people cannot get near, even in their imagination. In the gospel work, that instrument stopped being about entertainment and started being about worship. The gift found what it had always been reaching toward. And even as that inner transformation was happening, the men who had built the fire with him were beginning to fall away. In 1994, Maurice White stepped away from the road and handed the onstage leadership of Earth, Wind, and Fire to Philip Bailey. Publicly, it looked like a graceful transition, the founder giving the singer his flowers. Privately, it was something much darker. Maurice had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 1992, and he had hidden it for years. The tremors that were now making performance impossible for him were not a mystery. He was sick, and he was choosing when to tell the world. He would not fully make the disclosure public until years later, and even then he carried the weight of it with a private dignity. On February 4th, 2016, Maurice White died in Los Angeles.
Now to some sad news tonight about a member of the band that had us grooving for decades. What a great song. Now, the founder of Earth, Wind, and Fire, Maurice White, has passed away.
White was forced to stop touring with the band after developing Parkinson's disease. Maurice White died this morning in L.A. at the age of 74.
Now,
the man who had heard Philip Bailey's voice one Denver night in 1971 and decided to change his life, the founder, the visionary, the older brother of the whole enterprise, was gone. 6 years later, on April 24, 2022, the second blow landed. Andrew Woolfolk, Philip's oldest friend, the East High School mate he had pulled out of banking a lifetime earlier, died in Colorado at 71 after being ill for more than 6 years, weakened by the effects of a debilitating stroke. Bailey took to Instagram and wrote a farewell that read like it was carved out of him. He described meeting Andrew in high school, becoming friends and bandmates, and losing him from what he called this land of the dying to the land of the living. Two men who had defined the whole architecture of his adult life were now buried within 6 years of each other. Philip Bailey was still on stage. He was still hitting those ranges. But something inside the fire he had helped build was beginning to feel like the last flame in a very old torch. On May 8th, 2026, Philip Bailey turned 75, and by that point he had become something the music industry rarely produces. He had become a survivor. He is still touring, still standing on stage alongside longtime bandmates Verdine White, Maurice's brother, and percussionist Ralph Johnson, holding down what remains of the classic Earth, Wind, and Fire lineup. His 4-octave range is largely intact. The falsetto still reaches. His son, Philip Doran Bailey, now performs as a member of the same group his father joined at 21, quietly carrying the family fire into a second generation. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.